right, we'll be starting in a minute our Twitter space, and glad to see our speakers, Andrew and Linda, on board. And we'll stick to our agenda. So just waiting for the minute, and then I will set us up. Oh, yeah. So thanks a lot. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Given that it's a Twitter space, I know there are those who are within the borders of Kenya and some who might be beyond. So just to be safe, I'll start by using that salutation. My name is Barrack Otieno. I'm a trustee at the Kenya ICT Action Network, and I have the honor and privilege of moderating this conversation this great evening. We are going to have an interesting panel that I will shortly introduce. But before that, let me just give us a picture of what to expect. I'm going to give an opportunity to my panelists, or to the panelists, to introduce themselves. Considering the numbers in the room, it might not be feasible for everyone to introduce themselves, but probably you can, when we open the plenary, as you speak, please introduce yourself, your name, the organization that you represent, or if you don't represent an organization, you can speak to what interests you insofar as today's conversation is concerned. So after the introductions, we'll have a brief overview of what we are up to today, basically, which I will refer to as setting the scene. And my colleague Linda Gichohi, who has been moderating a discussion on the KICTANet mailing list and various other online spaces, will give us an overview of the conversation. I'm thereafter going to invite Andrew Aiston, who is well known in the community. I don't want to pull the rug from under his feet. I'll give him an opportunity to introduce himself, who will give us an industry perspective of how the piece of legislation or piece of regulation that we're going to discuss is going to have an impact on the industry. I'll open up the floor to all of you. This will basically be the plenary, and then we will have a conclusion. So this conversation will be summarized and curated and submitted to the government. I know there are many of us who have already submitted in one way or the other. We have had various online discussions going on in the course of the week, and this will just add to the conversation that has been going on nationally. So for those who are joining us, we are in this space. We are going to review the Computer and Cybercrimes Regulations 2023. There's been a lot of public participation going on at Pride In. There was a newspaper advert calling on the public to come and contribute, but I'm sure many of us may not have had an opportunity to go there. And so we thought it wise, as the Kenya ICT Action Network, to have the online discussion on the mailing list, and also to have a Twitter space discussion just to validate the conversations, after which we will submit. So allow me to introduce Linda, who has been leading the conversation on the KICTANet spaces and other community spaces, to briefly introduce herself and the subject at hand. And then I'll call upon Andrew Aiston thereafter to introduce himself as well. Then Linda will set the scene for us. So Linda, if you can hear me, you may take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Barrack. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the dissemination and consolidated report of the Computer Misuse, Cyber Crimes, Critical Information Infrastructure, and Cybercrime Management Regulations. I'm Linda Gichohi. I'm a lawyer by profession, legal tech and digital rights enthusiast with the Kenya ICT Action Network. So we are going to be talking about some of the comments and the things that we gathered out of the public participation forums that we've been having throughout this week. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Linda. Andrew, you have the floor.
Hi, my name's Andrew. Can you guys hear me okay at the moment? Barrack? Oh, there we go. Okay, now I think my microphone's working. So my name's Andrew Aiston. I am the CTO of Liquid Telecom Labs, our global R&D division based in Kenya. And I also serve as one of the routing area directors for the IETF. And that's me.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll be calling upon you later on to speak. I want to recognize each and every one of you. I see the KICTANet colleagues from KICTANet, but I'll invite them later on to chime in when we open the floor, just to recognize our CEO, Grace Githaiga, just to recognize Mr. Victor Capio, who is the head of our programs at KICTANet, among many other worthy listeners and netizens who've joined these conversations. I think as I go through the list, I'll keep recognizing each and every one of you. So to start us off, Linda, you could kindly set the scene in terms of the discussion that we have been having this week with regard to the computer and cybercrime regulations 2023. You can highlight what we have been discussing on the KICTANet mailing list and in many other spaces in a short format, for lack of a better word. I know that you have prepared a report from the discussions we've been having, and thereafter we'll also have Andrew to provide input from an industry perspective, and then based on your presentation and Andrew's presentation, we'll open the floor for reactions and contributions. So Linda, you may start us off, and then I will invite Andrew afterwards.
Thank you. So this could be having a lot of virtual public participation and public forums on the computer misuse and cyber crimes, critical information infrastructure, and cybercrime management regulations. There are many parts of this regulation. So the regulations are conferred by the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act 2018 and from the Cabinet Secretary for Interior and National Administration. The regulations contains the preliminary provisions. We have the administration and management of the committee. We have part 3, the cybersecurity operation centers. We have part 4, the critical information infrastructure, and part 5, the cybersecurity capacity and capability. We have the reporting mechanisms in place and the miscellaneous provisions. I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what the parts entail before I head into the comments and justifications from the public. So preliminary provisions entails citations, the interpretations, the definitions, the objects of the regulations, guiding principles, and also the scope. We have the administration and management of the committee, which essentially deals with the responsibilities of the committee, the conduct of business of the committee, and the role of the secretariat. We have the cyber security operation centers, which is entailed in the regulations. It entails the establishment and operations of the cyber security operation centers, monitoring and inspection processes related to the activities. We also have the critical information infrastructure, which is basically the main area on the regulations themselves. So the critical information infrastructure, and it encompasses of the critical aspects of managing, preserving, and protecting critical information infrastructure, which also includes designations, obligations, security measures, auditing, inspection, and also the establishment of the national public key infrastructure. We also have the cybersecurity capability and capacity part. This aims to strengthen the cybersecurity capabilities and capacity. It talks about training, research, information sharing, standards, collaboration between stakeholders, certifications of institutions, and also professionals in the field of cybersecurity. We have the reporting mechanism. This focuses on objectives, the procedures, and the methods of reporting cyber threats, which includes provisions for such as anonymous reporting to promote cybersecurity awareness and response. Have the miscellaneous provisions. This essentially covers the provisions that are related to cybersecurity and adoption of best practices on partnerships, dispute resolution mechanisms, and also entails regulation on data protection. And we have the schedule section, which is essentially the last part. It contains additional detailed information and also the forms related to compliance. The application forms and approvals that as a stakeholder you're supposed to just relate to. In terms of the comments, the submissions of the comments, and out of the virtual public participation, we had a few concerns. We had some justifications and also recommendations. So I'm going to start with the preliminary provisions, and on the interpretation part, there was an issue on the interpretation of the critical information infrastructure. So according to the regulation itself, it is defined as critical information infrastructure system or data and national critical information infrastructure. As you see, the regulation itself is not very clear. So one of the comments is that we should consider adapting the definition from the Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Act 2018, which clearly defines the critical information infrastructure, but according to the regulations, the definition itself is not very clear. So the justification was we need more clarity and recommendation that the core term used throughout the regulations should also the act should also be contained on the regulations. So we also had concerns in terms of the interpretation of the owner of critical information infrastructure, which includes the operator, authorized person in control, or any person in control of critical information infrastructure. So one of the comments received was that this is significantly problematic because it places ownership on every individual who have access to anything. According to the definition, it states that any person in control of the infrastructure or authorized person. So as long as you're authorized to control that critical information infrastructure, that will deem you as the owner according to the definitions in the regulations. So there is need to review the definitions in terms of both the critical information infrastructure and the owner. So we can, going to the objects of the regulations, we have Regulation 3A and B, which talks of providing a framework to monitor, detect, and respond to cybersecurity threats in the cyberspace. We also have A1, which talks about promote coordination, collaboration, cooperation, and shared responsibility amongst stakeholders in the cybersecurity sector, including critical infrastructure protection. So one of the issues that was raised was that, is this sufficient to allow each government-related cyber unit to operate efficiently without tough wars on who is more superior? Also considering, for example, the national KICTAnet, that was the national cybersecurity response team that was also meant to monitor and respond and also detect cybersecurity threats. We find that there is a clash of responsibilities here. So some of the recommendations was that they need to be, one of the comments was that how do you ensure that the framework remains adaptable also to evolving cyber threats and ongoing updates, and also flexibility on the same. So the recommendation was to have a dedicated cybersecurity agency, agency to have clear functions. We also have a recommendation that we need to develop a flexible regulatory framework that can adapt also to the evolving cyber threats, and have a comprehensive national cybersecurity strategy that aligns with the regulations themselves. We have the section of the regulation on 3G, which talks about approving the identification and designation of critical information infrastructure. So it was one of the comments of that it was a little bit vague, because who will be identifying, and is there criteria available for this definition? So there is need to have an extensive and elaborate criteria and identification specifications on that regulation. We also had under regulation 10 2B, which talks about have the capability to perform the functions of a sector cybersecurity operations center and critical information infrastructure cybersecurity center. So as you can see, this one of the comments that this seems to imply that there is a hierarchy in cybersecurity operation centers, and also there is a need for a clear outlining of the functions of each sector. So there is need for more clarity and also more clear functions in terms of the cybersecurity operation centers that have been mentioned there. We also had 13.2, which talks about the cybersecurity awareness program. Under the paragraph, it talks about some of the topics that are entailed there under the cybersecurity awareness program. So one of the issues was that, does this need to be prescriptive? Does one size fits all? How about emerging cyber threats? So one of the other comments was that, borrowing from ISO standards, it's best for the program to be as comprehensive and as prescriptive as possible to avoid assumptions. Another comment was that this provision is definitely too restrictive due to the rampant pace of technology in advancing of the technology. The cybercrime threats and are equally advancing at the same pace. So just having the topics there without considering that there can be other technology advances that come about, there's need for more flexibility there. There's also a recommendation on that the committee publishes a guideline on the topics for the awareness program and be sector specific as well. And further, the owners of critical information infrastructure can come up with a curriculum. The curriculum should be formulated in collaboration with relevant stakeholders to ensure that all the specific sectors are also included in the cyber security awareness program as outlined in the regulation itself. We also have on the same regulation, we have 3, which talks about the owner of critical information infrastructure shall, in consultation with the committee, review the cyber security awareness program at least once every 12 months to ensure that the program is adequate and that it remains up to date and relevant. So one of the questions was, is this a role for NC4? Review curriculum on infrastructure that it does not own, because when you talk about we have so many critical information infrastructures, and all of them are from also very different sectors. So when you talk about having the owner of critical information infrastructure, are they going to have all the owners in the committee? How are they going to ensure that the cybersecurity awareness program accommodates everything? So one of the recommendations was that conducting a one-size-fits-all review may result in ineffective and impractical recommendations that do not address unique cybersecurity needs for each entity. So for this, there is need for a multi-stakeholder approach and ensuring that all sectors are also accommodated in terms of the cybersecurity awareness program itself. So we have Regulation 14.1 on outsourced capabilities. So this talks about an owner of a critical information infrastructure, including government-owned critical information infrastructure who intends to outsource any operations, shall in writing notify the committee prior to outsourcing. The regulation itself also insists on most critical information infrastructure being in the country, and if you're going to outsource, there is need for notification to the committee. So this brought about the issue of are businesses not allowed to make independent decisions? So the other issues are comments that are raised in terms of administrative overhead and delays. We have so many critical information infrastructure. Is NC4, do they have that capacity, or will it also lead to potential delays, slowing down the outsourcing process, slow decision making, business continuity? We have issues like bureaucracy, complexity. Can this be effectively implemented? So one of the justifications and recommendations that there's need for more clarity, and the process, there's need to make the process as simple or as flexible as possible to ensure that even during emergencies that this issue can be addressed, because we know some of these approvals, notifications can also take a while. So that is also something that should be looked into. So under the same regulation 2, it talks about the external service provider shall report to the owner of the critical information infrastructure at least quarterly, notifying on the status of implementation of the obligations under the agreement, including notifying on any cybersecurity incident. So in terms of having the external service provider reporting to the owner of the critical information infrastructure, one of the issue that was raised was that should this not be a business arrangement maybe between the external service provider and the contractee? So this is also another issue in itself, just for them outlining some of the requirements in terms of quarterly reports. There's need for there's the issue of service providers reporting periodically to agencies overseeing the ecosystem. There's need for more flexibility, and or have the regulation itself removed, given that these are can be have an agreement between the provider and contractee. Is the regulation or is NCIFO just going to be able to review all this and ensure that this is also followed upon, given that most, let's say, companies and also organizations have their own reporting mechanisms in terms of just having the quarterly reports and all that. We also have under Regulation 18.3, which talks about which defines a treatment plan. It also talks about the business impact analysis of an organization shall be based on the potential impacts of business disruptions for each prioritized business function and processes. So one of the questions that was raised under the risk assessment and evaluation of cybersecurity operation centers was that, is this not too prescriptive? Is the committee assuming the role of a big bro? So one of the recommendations and justifications is that there is need for harmonization of the laws, because we find that there are other sectors. For example, we have the communications authority, we have other departments that also cater to this. Also, one of the justifications that there's need for a multi-stakeholder collaboration. Also, another issue that was raised here is administrative burden. Do they have the capacity to ensure that the regulations that they have set here, in terms of the approvals that was talked about, in terms of the notifications, will not cause disruptions in business continuity? There won't be administrative burden on the same. So we also have the regulation on 19.3a, it talks about the following criteria shall guide the classification of a critical information infrastructure. Sensitivity, it talks about sensitivity of the critical information infrastructure, including sensitive ICT-based sector, critical information infrastructure, or non-sensitive critical information infrastructure. So as it sounds, the issue was that the term sensitivity may require further elaboration to help the director in his task of determining what is sensitive. So there's need for more clarity in terms of the word sensitivity itself. So one of the justifications that this will guard against arbitrary decision making and ensure that the framework for designation is clear to both the designator and the designee. So we also have Regulation 24.2, which talks about application by owner of critical information infrastructure. So it talks about the owner of a critical information infrastructure may in writing apply to the director for declaration of a system as a critical information infrastructure. The application under that paragraph shall detail the resources available to the owner or person in control of the system. It talks about safeguard the system against disruption, failure, or degradation. It also talks about repair or replace the system. On this regulation itself, there was a lot of mishaps in terms of the numbering, in terms of how they've allocated also the sections themselves. So there's need for editing for further clarity as well. So we also have Regulation 29 on localization of critical information infrastructure, which states that the owner of a critical information infrastructure who intends to have critical information located outside Kenya shall apply to the committee in a given form CMCA3 that is set out in the third schedule. So in terms of this section, in terms of localization, one of the issues that was raised was that what are the implications of this on clouds such as AWS? We have organizations that use clouds that are designated outside Kenya. So another issue was how can the regulations mandating the localization of critical information infrastructure strike a balance between enhancing data sovereignty and the potential downsides such as operational complexity, business continuity risks, particularly when organizations utilize such global cloud services like AWS. So in terms of the regulation itself, some of the justification included considering introducing a more flexible regulation for, especially for, let's say, multinational organizations to be able to meet the localization requirements while ensuring data sovereignty.
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
So encouraging maybe robust business continuity, stakeholder consultations being very important on the same, so as to ensure that we do not impact innovation in the process, competitiveness, and also maybe deter foreign investment. So there's need for a more flexible approach on that. Especially also for maybe particularly companies that are startups and also have maybe some of their critical information infrastructure located outside Kenya. So again, this goes back to the definition of critical information infrastructure. As we continue, we also had a few general comments on the same. Some of them, one of the comments was that people think that we tend to be over legislating the regulations. We are not at the same. We cannot use the same regulations maybe as a country that is more technologically advanced, because we have to ensure that it is specific to our country and where we are, so that the regulations are not at the same time limiting our innovations and making it even harder for maybe startups, tech startups, just being able to advance. So as much as we are borrowing from maybe other regulations from other countries that are more advanced, we need to look at where we are at as a country. Another comment on the same was that there is need to create more awareness on what this framework aims to do to avoid the public feeling overwhelmed, that the regulations are specifically aimed at facilities, networks, and systems which, if disrupted, will have a destabilizing effect on national security. We also had a section that talks, the section that talks about surveillance in case there is failure of following the regulation itself. It talks about 24-hour surveillance. So the issue was, is this appropriate? Will this just be something that maybe that you will have to look at maybe your privacy rights, your data protection rights? So yeah, and another comment also that was raised was that the subject still sounds too elitist for the common man. Technology keeps advancing, and there is need for more effort by the Interior Ministry geared towards public awareness to enable the public to understand and appreciate their rights and responsibilities. So the need to make this, we don't want a case where maybe people are caught in a space where they have violated some of the regulations because they don't know exactly what the regulations mean for their companies and the critical information infrastructure that they handle. So those are some of the few comments that were raised so far. I just want to ask if there's any clarification, any comments on the same.
All right. Thanks very much, Linda. I will certainly open the floor to the plenary after Andrew also makes his comments. So without further ado, I would like to then invite Andrew to also share his reflections as an industry practitioner. When all is said and done, majority of the critical infrastructure is actually in the hands of the private sector. And the private sector has an important say in all this conversation. Andrew, if you're ready, you can take the floor.
So, can you guys hear me okay, Barrack?
Loud and clear.
Great stuff.
You can go ahead.
So, firstly, thank you, Linda. I found it very interesting listening to a lot of what Linda said there. I think that there may be some overlap in what I'm saying, but I think there's also a couple of places here where we found some other issues. When I did this review, firstly, I need to state that I'm not a lawyer. I need to say that loud and clear. But this is the kind of viewpoint that I came to in analyzing them. And what I did when I did this review is that I broke this down into what I kind of view as minor issues, medium issues, and major issues, as well as some other comments. So I'm going to take it from that perspective. We'll start with the minor issues. The definition of the cybersecurity incident, which when you read in the context of various other parts of the regulations, is problematic in many ways, because under the definition that's applied, the very audit of a system could be disrupted. If you are auditing a system and you're testing it for security problems, you may end up disrupting something. This is why you generally schedule time to do such audits. And with that definition, you could actually end up triggering incidents that have ramifications. So that was a bit of a concern. That was the one issue that I found which was kind of minor. When we get to the medium issues, however, we'll start with section 55.2F, refers to the registration of cryptography service providers, except there's no definition of what a cryptography service provider is. Now, a cryptography service provider could mean pretty much anything. You know, if I go and am compressing some files for you and I'm encrypting them, am I a cryptography service provider? I don't know. So there needs to be a clear definition of that. The definition section also defines the owner of a critical information infrastructure as including the operator authorized person in control of any person figure something on a network under that definition would be the owner of the critical information infrastructure, and it places ownership on potentially very junior people, and it creates potential liability for people without management control or fiduciary duty. That we view as quite problematic. In Section 8C, it assigns the function of undertaking of audits of critical information systems to the Secretariat of the Committee. And Section 8G also assigns the Secretariat of the Committee the responsibility for auditing risk assessment reports. These are not the functions of a Secretariat. The Secretariat may be able to facilitate such work going, but they are not the functions of a typical Secretariat. In Section 12.2F, it states that every critical infrastructure SOC will have responsibility for research and development of tool engineering. Now, if you look at it, and where it says that every critical services infrastructure will have its own SOC effectively, or potentially they could share one, but they could also have their own. This is impractical and it won't work. The duplication of resources would be absolutely immense. And we think that this could be done a lot more efficiently. In Section 14.4, it makes vague references to a database. And the text seems to assume that every critical infrastructure provider has a database. If you are a fiber provider, you may or may not have a database. So there's no guarantee that there's even going to be a database. And that was a little bit strange. Section 35.1 refers to the owner or operator of a gateway. And the term gateway isn't defined anywhere. And I'm going to come back to this point in a minute because there are a couple of very serious problems with Section 35.1. In Section 55G, it implies that anybody running a public NTP server needs to be registered and will have their operations monitored. There are thousands of public time servers out there, and we just don't see a need for this. And again, it seems really onerous for no benefit. But now we get to the serious issues. So I'm going to start with the definition of transfer of critical information infrastructure. And this is a really interesting one because you need to kind of follow through the full logic of this. So the transfer of a critical information infrastructure is defined as inclusive of copying or moving a program or data to any computer system, device, or storage mechanism other than that in which it is stored, and a number of other inclusive definitions. The problem with that is this. When you designate a web server as critical infrastructure, so say eCitizen, as these regulations allow, anyone who so much as browses that website is going to be, under that definition, transferring critical information infrastructure. Because what does the web browser do? It copies data off the server. And so when you read this in conjunction with sections 43.1, no person would be able to browse the website of any critical infrastructure system, which is all the government sites, without written authorization from the committee. To imply a hierarchy in cybersecurity operation centers where you've got critical information security operation centers that are subservient to sector cybersecurity operation centers, which are in turn subservient to National Cybersecurity Operations Center. Now, the Kenya National Cybersecurity Strategy document actually makes no reference to sector SOCs, and we view that as problematic. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the SOCs when I get to that. In section 12.1, it says that every critical information system infrastructure shall have its own security operations center. That's not practical or financially viable. There needs to be a lot more consolidation there, particularly when you consider that the regulations allow even a single web server system to be declared potentially as critical information infrastructure. You can't run an entire SOC for a website. It just won't work. In section 18.2, now this is really interesting because section 18.2 is outside of the sections that refer to critical information systems. Our reading of this was that this actually applies to, well, pretty much everything because it doesn't refer to critical information systems. And what it says is that within 6 months of the date of commencement of the regulations, that everybody must have a risk assessment done. Now, if our reading is correct, this doesn't only apply to critical information infrastructure systems. I need to make a point that just between July 2021 and February 2022, there were 30,100 businesses registered in Kenya, tens of thousands more outside that. These reports have to be filed with the director of the committee and reviewed. Now, if that isn't only the critical information infrastructure systems, that's a volume of data that makes this totally and utterly impractical. It just cannot be done. There aren't enough auditors to do it. In section 18.7, it gives the power to the director of the committee to request the organization under security assessment to provide the director with further information and carry out inspections. This effectively gives the director of the committee the power to request pretty much anything and conduct inspection on private organizations in the country. That doesn't seem to be limited to critical infrastructure providers either. That is severely problematic because without limitations on what further information can be requested, there is a lot of proprietary information, and we view that as really problematic. In section 21.2, it gives the director of the committee the power to direct the owner of critical infrastructure systems to take a variety of measures. This includes the implementations of firewalls and other such infrastructure. Now, these things have a cost, and it doesn't place any burden on the committee to justify the need for these things, nor are we sure that the external committee necessarily has the capabilities to assess the needs for these things or the implications of implementing these things. So, for example, if you tell a service provider that's got a multi-100 gig backbone to go and implement a firewall on all their transit links, that's not how the internet works. And it would be ridiculously expensive, and it would be completely unnecessary, and it would actually break things. So that's problematic. There needs to be a lot more refinement in the word there. It further goes on to say that one of the remedies for non-compliance with this allows a referral to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. So taken in full context, what this means is the state can declare something as critical infrastructure, then make a demand that whatever that is, put some very expensive hardware in place, and then prosecute anybody who doesn't comply, irrespective of the financial burden that that can impose. That's problematic. In section 27.1, it states that the owner of any critical information infrastructure shall not make any significant change to design, configuration, security, or operations of a critical information infrastructure without prior approval. That effectively says that if a provider wishes to enhance their network, they're limited from doing so without approval. If they need to make a change, potentially in an emergency to route around some breakage, etc., they need approval, which can take 48 hours. Basically, all of your change control becomes beholden to this committee, which can take 48 hours to approve things. That is really, really problematic and would severely degrade the operations of private entities. And we really view that as probably one of the most problematic clauses in these proposed regulations. And it goes on to say in 27.3, as I said, that the director must consider the application within 48 hours. Of the impact this could be having on your network while you wait to do said change. Now, in section 27.5, it ties the provisions of the entire section 27 to section 14.2 of the Cybercrime Act. This gets very interesting if you follow the logic, because section 14.2 of the Cybercrime Act, specifically 14.2b, states that access by a person to a computer system is unauthorized if that person does not have consent from any person who is entitled to access the computer system through any function to the program or data. What that implies is, since the committee is granting permission in order to proceed with change control, logically, they are entitled to have access to those systems. And so if you read this in conjunction with the Cybercrimes Act clause that they're citing there, the committee has access to every system within a critical infrastructure provider. And that is really, really kind of problematic. Then we get to section 35.1f. And I said earlier that I would talk a little bit more about gateway providers. There is no definition of a gateway provider. So our reading of this is that this probably refers to cable landing stations. And what this says is that under 35.1f, that a gateway provider shall utilize secure communication protocols and encryption for data transmissions through the gateways in order to reduce the risk of data interception and manipulation. Here's the problem. These cable landing stations can carry terabits of traffic. Typically, you've got an optical multiplexer in there with no active equipment to see the traffic encrypted, decrypted, or anything else. You would need a warehouse-sized set of systems to do that level of real-time encryption. You would need it on the other end at every cable landing station to then do the decryption. It is totally and utterly impractical and completely non-financially viable. It also would dictate that where somebody is buying a wavelength rather than an actual data connection, that wavelength would have to be passed through infrastructure that had access to the traffic, which seems to be almost contrary to the intent that I read into the clause. It also says in section 44.1 that it empowers the director to appoint auditors to audit any critical information system. The auditors there would be, by the very nature of their job, they'd have access to huge amounts of information. This violates the principle of least privilege and concentrates access of a huge amount of data from private companies into the hands of a single committee, particularly when it states that section 44.3 deems anyone appointed as an auditor to be staff of the committee. So effectively, the committee has the power to say, we want an audit on this, we'll have access to all the information, and that information, there could be vast volumes of information concentrated in the hands of a very few people as a result. And we think that's pretty dangerous. It says in section 48.2 that the committee may direct their auditors to carry out a compliance test to ascertain the adequacy and effectiveness of controls. That again needs a lot more clarification, because there are controls against things like distributed denial of service prevention mechanisms. And should the committee decide to direct a compliance test against distributed denial of service systems, that could end up destabilizing entire systems of private companies inadvertently. So again, there needs to be a lot more control and a lot more definition around how that's done. In section 70.1 allows for anonymous reporting channels of cybersecurity incidents, and while this is a good thing, the section seems to directly contradict section 69.1a of the same regulations, which say that people reporting must give their full name, address, and everything else. So there's a little bit of a conflict there, and we felt that that needed a bit of clarification. Finally, with regards to the security operations centers, the document refers to national cybersecurity operations centers. It refers to the sector cybersecurity operations centers, and it refers to your critical infrastructure information system having cybersecurity operations centers. The level of duplication there just doesn't make sense. And it also doesn't seem to align with the cybersecurity vision and strategy that was published, which makes no reference to every single sector suddenly having a cyber operations center. So when you look at what they're trying to do there, where each of these SOCs has an entire range of functions, and some of these functions include the design and development of engineering tooling. Now, if you end up with 20,000 SOCs because of the way the infrastructure is written, because of the way the regulations are written, and you've got 20,000 people trying to do engineering tooling of the same thing, it's an absolute waste of resource, not to mention the fact that one of the things that we struggle with already is that we need to do a lot more capacity development. We need a lot more people, but at the moment, we don't have enough people to do that. And so that's also got a number of issues. We do feel that with all of these issues that the regulations in cybersecurity are necessary. We need cybersecurity regulations. But we need to strike a balance between regulation that is helpful and over-regulation. If you over-regulate and the regulations are unenforceable, you'll end up being unable to enforce even the good parts. And so we kind of feel that these regulations need to be simplified. There needs to be a lot more work done in these regulations to actually follow through the logic in some of these things to its full extent, to determine the real impact. And we also feel that you've got to balance the needs of cybersecurity with the rights of private entities to actually operate business, because otherwise you end up with a situation where you have effectively nationalized all control of this infrastructure while leaving fiduciary duty and control with the business owners, as well as all the risk with those business owners. That is massively problematic. But yeah, that's our take.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really insightful and deep from a practitioner's perspective. I must admit that, Andrew, you had mentioned earlier, we needed 2 hours for this conversation. It's just unfortunate that the hour of the day may not permit that. But I want to open up the floor for quick reactions for the next, it's now 8:54, for the next 4 minutes or so that we can wrap up at the top of the hour. We can continue with the conversation on Twitter and on the KICTANet mailing list and other spaces that we do have. I think Andrew and Linda have really set the scene for us, and we can see the impact of what this piece of legislation is likely to bring in the sector. So I think I will need help from our secretariat desk. Anyone who needs the floor to speak, I just have 4 minutes for reactions. Apologies, really. This was so deep, and it may have needed more time. Any quick reactions? I don't seem to see.
Hi, Barrack.
Hi.
This is Nyali here. Just 2 quick reactions from me.
Yeah.
One is on the sector SOCs. I'll echo what Andrew has said. The financial implications on licenses and hardware is insane. If you look at some of these organizations, a number of them are non-profits. I don't see how they'll handle these financial implications. Such licenses and hardware would really run them to the ground in such a case. 2, when you're looking at different businesses, the approvals for data residing outside the country can impact your response to an incident. If your systems are down, it would be easier to spin up an AWS instance or an instance somewhere else to get services back to your clients. I mean, every minute counts in that case where you're losing funds or business. So having to sit through a 48-hour approval process may just kill you in that case. So they need to think about express approvals in such kind of situations. Just those 2 issues I'd like to raise.
Thank you very much for being on point. Anyone else who wants the floor? You can follow suit.
Yes, Barrack, could I go?
Yes, please, take the floor.
Yes, I'd like to agree with the previous speakers. For me, I think the thing that stands out is the fact that, one, this proposed regulation is biting more than it can chew, or rather is an attempt to bite way, way, way more than it should in terms of restricting itself to the mandate under the main act. Secondly, from a legal perspective, it is essentially, in my view, ultra-vires in the sense that it is going beyond what was expected to do under the main act. Secondly, is that it has created a super admin who is the director of the committee with very, very extensive powers to receive applications, make approvals, decide on so many very important things. And yet, under the Mother Act, the director is just to coordinate the secretariat. Number 3 is that there are quite a number of repetitions, and I think some have already alluded to this, lack of definition of key terms, attempts to create new structures that are not known in cybersecurity or even in other existing documents, a lack of coherence in terms of what it is attempting to achieve, because if you want to improve cybersecurity in the country, the purpose and mandate of the committee was to promote coordination. Yet the nature and extent of the act, that the regulation that they are provided, do not in any way speak to strengthening the coordination framework for promoting cybersecurity in the country. And I think lastly, also because of time, this is an omnibus regulation that ideally should be split There are things that ideally should be left as guidelines. The regulation is too prescriptive, and like Aiston said, it will be difficult to implement given the onerous obligations it is giving individuals and companies who are expected to support, cybersecurity initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. And colleagues, I beg your indulgence to allow me to add an additional 10 minutes. I promise you we'll end after exactly 10 minutes. I guess the conversation is just starting to get exciting when it's ending. So I will add 5 minutes for any other inputs, and then I will allow the speakers concluding remarks. Anyone else who wants to take the floor, please be brief.
Hi, Barrack. Thank you for this.
Yes, please.
Lawrence here.
Yes.
So Victor has said actually a lot of things I wanted to say. So not to repeat what has already been covered, I'll say in the spirit of the regulation, they're in the right place. However, one, a lot of those clauses and sections need to be rewarded. The regulatory body, the committee, the secretariat should not be developing things, should be oversight. We should not be reinventing the wheel. If you go through the regulations, there are a lot of duplication in regards to what other bodies are doing locally and regionally and even internationally. Then lastly, too much power. The director is being given too much power, which can be abused to actually cause harm and go against the intentions of the regulation and even the act. Thank you so much for having us and hosting this.
Thank you very much. Who else wants to take the floor and be brief in the same fashion? All right. I think hearing no one, I would wish to then come back to the panel. I'll request Andrew, maybe in briefly, your parting shot or closing remarks. All right. Looks like Andrew is... Andrew, can you hear me? Or you're in it's like you're in listening mode. Okay, let's Linda, if you can take the floor. Your parting shot.
Thank you, Barrack. My parting shot in terms of the regulation is that, first of all, there is need for more clarity in the roles of the committee, the director, and the secretariat. Echoing the fact that the director holds a lot of power, do they, as NC4, have the capacity in terms of also approvals in terms of the audits? Are we assured that the data will be safe? Because like cybersecurity experts have the specific codes that when they work with the specific organizations, they assure them that it is something that is private, is something that's confidential. So when they're doing the audits and all that, are we assured that the data will be safe? Also, more collaboration with other stakeholders, harmonizing of the laws, because we can see a little bit of overreaching to other bodies and agencies that are already in place. We also have the fact that are we assured that all the regulations they've given themselves to a vast institutional framework of very many responsibilities. Are we assured that there'll be no administrative overhead and delays, bureaucracy? Do they just ensure that they collaborate with the specific agencies that also have some of the mandates that has been included in the regulations themselves? So, and lastly, while the coordination between the public and private actors is given prominence in the implementation of the regulations, there's also just a little bit reference of the Data Protection Act under Regulation 75. So there's no particular reference of the Office of the ODPC, which especially in cases where determinations need to be made about adequacy of measures for the protection data that is very crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Andrew, are you able to speak now? All right. Okay, I think we are facing some technological challenges, but we can continue the conversation on Twitter. I'm in touch with Andrew. Apologies for those technological glitches. I just want to thank each and every one of you on behalf of the Kenya ICT Action Network for creating time for this space after your busy schedules. And I look forward to engaging and meeting you in more of the spaces that we are going to have as KICTANet towards the end of the year. If need be, we could organize another round of this conversation, depending on the interest. But for now, thank you and have a good rest of the evening. We want to assure you that your comments will be collected and submitted in response to the public call that has been made through various media channels. For now, thank you very much. Have a great evening and see you on the internet in the near future once again. Goodbye.